So without further ado, I will turn it over to Hannah to take it away, and I will advance her slides as she goes. Hannah, it's all you.
All right, why don't we just go right ahead to the first slide?
Perfect.
So my name's Hannah. I own and operate Medicine Creek Farm outside of Finlayson, Minnesota, which is up in northeastern corner of the state. We raise grass-fed beef and lamb and pastured pork, and we direct market our products mostly to the Twin Cities and Duluth, and we sell through our website. That's our primary mode of selling. And I'm the primary farmer on the farm. My husband, Jason, usually works off farm. Of course, it also takes a lot of teamwork. Next slide. So this is just kind of silly. I don't know if you guys know that iPhone has this automatically generated selfie album now. And when I was going to put my presentation together, I realized that this is what mine looks like. And so that's just to say I'm really excited to be here and have someone I can talk to about my sheep for a whole hour. I really think sheep are wonderful, and I don't think everyone understands why. My husband sometimes refers to my shepherding as me just being out meddling with my sheep. And anyway, so I just like to share a little bit of what I know about meddling. You can go to the next slide. So kind of my goals are just to share the basics to get started, especially if you're starting from scratch. If you have limited startup money, if you're on rented land or land without infrastructure, or if you have zero customers. I think there will also be something here if you're like a vegetable or poultry or cattle farmer and you're thinking about diversifying. But then my other goal is really to convince you that sheep are great for beginners. My vegetable farming friend said to me the other day, I always heard sheep die easily, bloat easily, and are a bit dim upstairs. Are these rumors false? And so my goal is really to dispel those rumors and make the case that there's a lot of reasons that sheep make sense for beginners. And I'll kind of try to share that throughout the presentation. But just as some background, I grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota, corn and soybean farm. I went away to college. I had a career in politics and government. And while I learned a lot and enjoyed it, I would say I was kind of pretty miserable at a desk job. Because I was interested in advocacy, I started volunteering with some farming organizations. I met a lot of cool young farmers, and I kind of tiptoed my way into agriculture through working in marketing for some food businesses. And then I got laid off. And so when I got laid off, I found myself with all this free time, and I ended up growing my very first vegetables, even though I grew up on a farm. I grew my first vegetables on a rooftop farm in Brooklyn. So that's that picture kind of in the middle there. And I quickly realized how much happier I was being outside and not behind a desk. And so I kind of had been thinking about it for a while, and I jumped right into a year-long apprenticeship at Kinderhook Farm. And so that's me on the right at Kinderhook. That's where I was introduced to sheep. It's where I learned most of what I know about shepherding, from Anna there on the left and Lee. And I was hooked. I loved it. They have a flock of about 500 sheep, and they're pretty big at 1,200 acres. They have an on-farm store and a farm stay, and they do a lot of direct marketing. And then they also have customers in New York City at some of the big butcher shops. Anyway, so I decided to move back to Minnesota and make a go of it. Next slide. So my first enterprise, I started raising 10 pigs on rented land. And that rented land, I think you went one too far. Oh, wait, can you go ahead? I think I switched the order. Yeah, there you go. So next one where it says belly rub bacon. And then we'll go back, sorry. So, you know, especially if you have access to some infrastructure, pigs are great. And I would never discourage anyone from doing pigs first. But that picture on the bottom there is kind of what I would say is the biggest barrier to starting with pigs, if you have no infrastructure, is pig feed. And, you know, a lot of heavy barrels, they're heavy, they're hard to move. There's a lot of like shoveling of feed back and forth. And if you don't have like any grain storage bins on your farm, that just becomes difficult. And sheep don't need anything but grass. So now go back a slide, sorry. And so in that time, I also met my husband, Jason, and I introduced him to sheep. We were going to a lot of field days and winter conferences. And at the PFI conference, I think I heard about this bus trip to Gabe Brown's ranch. And we went that summer. And basically that was like what converted Jason to the religion of soil health and got him super excited about farming. And so that year we took the Land Stewardship Project's Farm Beginnings program, which is a lot like PFI's savings incentives program. It has that same feature. And by the end of that class, we were like really excited and ready to go and felt like we had done a lot of planning. So next slide. 2 slides, I guess. Yeah. So in April of 2016, we bought farmland in Finlayson. It's about an hour and a half north of the Twin Cities and an hour south of Duluth, right off of 35. So it's a really good location for selling and delivering. We did pick this location because it was close enough to the city for Jason to keep his off-farm job, but also land was really cheap, especially compared to southern Minnesota where I was from and where I had rented. And we really knew at that point that we wanted as many acres as we could afford because we were passionate about soil health and grazing. But next slide. The thing about it is that it was 160 acres and no infrastructure, completely raw land. It had just been hayed and sometimes cropped previously. And so what we kind of just jumped right into was 20 sheep, 15 pigs, 2 cows, 16 chickens, 4 dogs, and nothing. Next slide. So we rented a house down the road from the land while Jason and one of our buddies started building the house. And basically the first thing we did was like put in a driveway and a well right in the center of the farm. A nice thing about starting with raw land is we kind of got to design it exactly how we wanted. And that has been really great. So we got the well hooked up to electric by July. And next slide. And so while he was building the house, I got going. I got our first FSA microloan. And that's how we bought our flock and startup equipment. And then I started grazing right away. You can also see that I was pregnant at the time. So that was a component. I included here, you know, what we paid just as an example. And, you know, those prices will vary a lot, depends on what's around you, but I just wanted to share like just what we did. And another important thing I wanted to mention is that because we knew we couldn't graze all 160 acres to start, like we knew we wouldn't have that many animals and we kind of needed to build slowly, we made an arrangement with the previous renters to let them keep haying the land. And that worked great. We actually did that for a couple of years until now we're grazing the whole property. And, you know, that first year they hayed in June, and then I got the sheep in July. And, you know, by August, like I just grazed around the bales. It was like no big deal. It worked great. Next slide. So one of the other great things about starting with sheep is that you can buy, you know, feeder lambs and just finish them by the winter. So, you know, unlike cattle, you don't necessarily have to keep your sheep over the winter. But if you do want to do breeding stock, I would just say, you know, what we got were what's called Tamarack sheep. They're a cross of Ile-de-France and Dorset. And the thing that makes them, you know, what we think was a good choice was that they're grass-fed genetics. So they come from a grass-based system. They come from someone who does pasture lambing and doesn't have a barn, doesn't put them in a barn. And we met this person. So we got our sheep from Janet McNally. She's pretty much our shepherding mentor now. She lives just about 20 miles from us. And we got to know her actually through the Land Stewardship Project. And she's been shepherding and breeding in this area for over 30 years. And so we had a lot of trust about what she was doing. And then we started with 10 ewes from her. And then the 10 feeders we actually got from her neighbor who had gotten her sheep from Janet. So we knew they were kind of all the same stock. But I would say when you're starting something, you know, find a reputable breeder, find someone you can trust who's been doing it a long time. But then, you know, some questions to ask when you're looking at sheep are, have they been fed any grain in their system? Is that part of it? Because if they've been fed grain, you're not going to be able to expect them to finish at the same weight in the same amount of time as on grass. And then also just some basic like disease questions you want to ask, especially if you're starting with raw land that's never seen livestock. You're not going to want to bring disease onto that soil. So ask about foot rot if that's ever been in their flock. And then there's two main ones for sheep you want to kind of ask about. And one is OPP, which is ovine progressive pneumonia. And then the other one is John's disease. And basically these are both incurable. You don't want to get those genetics. So sometimes it's, hard to know for sure, but ask about testing, ask what they know about it. And just make sure you're not getting yourself into a situation from the start. Next slide. So we also got livestock guardian dogs. We started with 2, but we have really heavy coyote pressure, and we're also in wolf territory where people have been known to lose actually full grown cows to wolves. So we now have 5 livestock guardian dogs, and we raise puppies. We started raising puppies last year as well. They do make shepherding wonderful. I love our dogs, but I'll just say, like, as a beginner, they might not be necessary for you. You should ask other shepherds in your area whether or not there's a depredation issue or problem. You also might not need so many dogs, maybe 1 or 2. There's lots of opinions about LGDs and also the other available guardians you can use for sheep. I could do a whole presentation on them alone, and I don't have time. So all I'm really going to say is, 1, for us, they cost $50 a month per dog for dog food. So just be prepared for that extra cost, but they work. We haven't lost any sheep, any livestock to predators since we started. So they definitely work. Next slide. So now I'm going to launch into infrastructure. Next slide. I'm going to assume that most people are familiar with the concept of rotational grazing and holistic management, sometimes also called adaptive grazing. I'm not really gonna explain it too much other than to just say that it's great for soil health and it sequesters carbon. What we do is usually daily moves, sometimes every other day moves. Daily is really best for the soil, but especially if you're starting alone, it is really nice to do every other day moves. You can move the sheep one day and kind of all the stuff you're moving with them. And then the next day, take down your back fences, set up your next paddock in the hopscotch system. And that'll make it easier on you as you're kind of getting used to the rhythm. The other thing to mention is the importance of rotating to small ruminant health. The big thing to know about sheep is parasites. Parasites are what will make raising sheep difficult, but when you properly rotationally graze, you break the parasite life cycle. And so one of the main parasites that becomes difficult with sheep is the Barber poleworm. This is a blood-sucking worm that causes anemia. It's in their stomach. But if you do a 60-day rotation, you're breaking that life cycle. So if your rotation is long enough that you're not coming back to someplace they've eaten until after 60 days, parasites aren't really a problem. And, there's this myth that sheep die easily. And I would say when you're on healthy rotated pastures, that's just not true. I would also say an advantage of rotational grazing is that you're seeing your sheep every day. People who probably lose a lot of sheep are like putting them out, not looking at them every day, not interacting with them. And when you're out there observing them every day, you can catch things much sooner. And the number one animal welfare thing I learned from working at Kinderhook was how to observe the sheep and like what to look for. So it'll take some practice, but just being with your sheep, watching what's normal, getting used to what are normal habits for them, and then noticing any outliers. So if everyone is up grazing and somebody is lying down over here in the corner, something could be wrong. You should go check them out. You also sometimes want to look for anyone whose like head is down and ears are droopy and they're maybe moving with the flock, but they're not actually eating if you look at them closely. It's like they're pretending to graze. So when people say sheep are dumb, what I would say is that's not true at all. They follow the flock because that is protection. You know, it's smart for them to stay with the flock. That's what provides protection. And so when they're sick, they're going to pretend that they're healthy. So they're going to be with the flock, maybe they're going to be pretending to eat, but if you look closely, you'll notice they're not. And you'll get better at time at picking up on those signals. Next slide. So Electronet is the most common thing I think that people use for rotationally grazing with sheep. There are other brands and other things you can investigate and totally do. Some people swear by other systems, but I use Premier's Electronet, so I'm just going to talk about that. Some people are also like terrified of Electronet and think it's awful, but I actually love it. And I love it more than polywire reels for cattle. Those tend to like jump off the reel and get super tangled for me. And at this point, I'm just so used to Electronet that I think it works great and I prefer it. I would say watch the videos on Premier's website or on YouTube and learn how to properly use them so that you're not frustrated. Most of the time frustration is because you're doing it wrong, just like user error. And those videos make it pretty clear, or even better, you know, find someone to show you the proper way to do it. And I would say, you know, most likely you're going to want to just use the regular Electronet. You know, I put up a couple of the options here, but the 164 foot roll, it's 35 inches high. And I really do recommend the single spike. We do have some with the double spike, but they're much heavier. And I just don't think they're necessary unless your soils are, you know, pretty difficult. I will say, you know, with just like basic rotating, you're probably going to want 4 fences to start. And you kind of just make one square with 2 fences and then use the next 2 fences to set up the next paddock. Then when you move, you take down the back and you just hopscotch it to the next. Just a quick tip is like, if you have extra length of fence that's like not making a paddock, you should always put that up too. You don't want anything lying on the ground or it'll draw down your charge. Next slide. So one of the things Premier recommends, this top left photo, is laying it out first on the ground and kind of pulling it tight and making your square before you go back and put it up. Once you get good at it, I don't actually do it that way anymore, but I do recommend that way to start just until you get the hang of it. And doing that way also lets you drive a 4-wheeler along the outside of your fence to mat down the grass. And that will help keep grass off your fence and keep the fence hotter. So the other thing I wanted to mention here was stocking density, because I know people have a lot of questions about that. And I'm just going to say, like, there are calculations. You can, you know, go online and look at that stuff. But what I've really found is you need to just observe what's happening, how much they're eating, and also just be realistic about your own management. Like, don't make it difficult for yourself. Especially when you're starting. Do what makes sense for you in terms of size and putting up the fence, and then kind of do the adaptive grazing from there. So start with a square, see how much they eat based on how many animals you have. It's going to vary a lot with the time of the year, you know, how much it's rained, what your pasture quality is like on the soils you're starting with. So, you know, you can use those stocking density rates, but it just might not be the case. So it's better to really just look. If you walk out there and there's still a ton of grass and you were ready to move them, just leave them there a little bit longer. Or, you know, the opposite case, move them faster, start moving them daily instead of every other day. So I really think it is more of an art than a science, and don't get too caught up in sort of the numbers. Next slide. So solar chargers are sort of the thing that makes the Electronet fences work. There are a lot of different kinds, a lot of different prices. The photo in the middle is the 3 that we have right now. I would say the one on the right I got on Craigslist for $75. And while it has less output, it still works and I still use it. But that one in the middle is kind of what Premier's promoting right now, is kind of their best one. You know, they keep developing and kind of making them better. And I would say it is great. We use it the most. It's easily portable. It's the 1.2 joule. I think they call it the Max 120 with a 10-watt panel. That one is $370. And for us, we can use that for up to 10 fences. Usually we use it for about 6, but it will definitely make 4 fences super hot. So you could also get away with less if you're just going to use, 4 fences. But if you're planning on growing, or you don't really know your future, it might be nice just to get the good one to start with. But I also say the photo on the right is Janet McNally's setup. And, she basically built her own using a fencer and a deep cycle battery and a big solar panel. And I think she never worries about the fence not being hot, but takes more work, and it's not as portable and easy to move. Next slide. This is my basic watering setup. So, we do have a 4-wheeler. We have the basic livestock trough, and then this 100-gallon water tank that we have on a utility trailer. The top left is Janet McNally's again, hers. I took a lot of pictures of her stuff when I was starting. And then, the bottom left is ours. And you can also, carry like tools and your fences on this. And I'm just showing this as sort of rough costs. Let's go to the next slide. So sometimes I walk and carry my fences, but this is also just to show that like it's nice to have a 4-wheeler to help move fences around. The livestock tank I have is a 60-gallon poly tank, and it's also, I use the 4-wheeler sometimes to move it, but I can also easily drag it. It's not too heavy. But one big advantage of sheep is that they drink way less than cattle. So especially when you're starting with a small flock like we did, I could fill it every other day and they still wouldn't drink it all. So I wouldn't have to haul the water out there every day. Now, even with, up to like we're almost to 100 sheep, I really only have to fill it every day on hot summer days. When it cools down, they're back down to drinking maybe half a tank. And then one thing you can do with the water too is you can scoot it under the fence to move it to the next paddock. So if you kind of plan ahead, you strategize where you're going to put the water tank, you can use it for 2 paddocks. And that just makes it easier too. So you can fill it once, and if it still has water, and scoot it under. Let's see. Okay, next slide. And I just wanted to mention that if you don't have a 4-wheeler or don't want to get a 4-wheeler, you can also haul water with a pickup truck if you have that. That's one way to do it if you don't have a well on site. Like if you're renting land that doesn't have a well, but you have access to water somewhere else, you could haul from that location with a pickup truck a little bit easier than the 4-wheeler. It is a little more compaction on the soils, but I would say do what you have to do to get started. And then I also just wanted to mention, the well was the first thing we put in, and it cost about $6,000. And we also, got it hooked up to electric right away. We were building the house, so we needed that anyway. But you can run a well pump on a generator, or there are also solar chargers for that too. So know that that's a possibility. Next slide. And then shade. So we have very few trees, mostly just willow. And, I started thinking that the shade was really just for the dogs, but really the sheep quickly started using it too. And so my first iteration was that bottom left. I wanted something really light and easy to move. And so it was just like a frame out of 2x4s with a tarp over it. And I could kind of fold it up and carry it. And that was nice, but they destroyed it like immediately. It didn't last for very long. So that bottom center one is what we then moved to. We made 2 of these just little lean-tos, super simple. Like what you see there is just how to screw it together, and it works great and they love it. It is a lot heavier, but I flip it over and drag it. And, I've dragged it all over our farm at this point, and it's been manageable. But then, also quickly realizing how much the sheep wanted to use it too, I started to investigate other options. And so we had this mobile chicken coop, which we had used a little bit, but we had just like collected people's city chickens and they weren't laying in the coop anymore. So we decided to get rid of the chickens when winter came. And so that next summer I was like, well, we just have this, so let's just see if it works for shade. And I pull it with the quad, and it worked pretty well, but there were some disadvantages to like the height and things. So it just got me thinking. And so next slide, what I then did was I just found an old Haywagen on Craigslist for $150. And it needed some repairs, like some new boards, but it actually works awesome. You can fit a lot more sheep under there. You can still pull it with a four-wheeler or a truck. And I'll also just say you can see Polly up there on top of it. If you have any livestock guardian dogs who don't defend their food from the sheep, which can sometimes happen, I feed them up there on the Haywagen, and that works great. Next slide. I'm going to try to quickly talk through having a working area. So this is also something you may not necessarily need, but if you're going to vaccinate or shear, or you do need to deworm, you can make a simple one with hog or cattle panels and T-posts. It's also helpful for like when you're loading them to take them to market. But again, I would say that's not 100% necessary. You can do it with Electronet. It's not as easy, but you can do it. And some people also use portable gates and attach them to their trailer. So you can drive the trailer out to the paddock, put up like portable gates and use that to load them. And so that top left photo was our first winter before we had a good working area. And we like tried to use the trailer and the car to like push them up against and the Electronet. And you know, we made it work, but for our first shearing, we realized we needed something a little bit better. So we did set up this basic pen. It's basically just a square with cattle panels, and then we used hog panels as kind of a chute to lead down to where the shearer was. And I would say the top right photo you can see is like the next iteration of what we did. And really, we only had to do that because of our cattle. So another advantage of sheep is you don't need this like robust system. The cattle panel really works okay. And you don't need a squeeze chute necessarily. Next slide. And I'm going to try to quickly just talk about shearing. There are hair breeds of sheep, so if you want to avoid shearing entirely, you can, and that may be recommended depending on your location. Because of our northern winter, we really felt like we needed, you know, a hardier breed of sheep. And we shear in April before lambing, and we do also vaccinate at that time. We use Covaxin 8. It's $40 a head setup for our shearing plus $5 a head. That's just like ours. I think that cost varies a lot, but that's just to let you know, kind of a base. And actually we have to consider shearing an expense because the cost of shearing is more than what the wool brings in. We just give our wool to the shearer and he sells it to what's called the Mid-States Wool Co-op for us. And at the end of the year, we get a check. It's not enough to cover the cost of the shearing. I do really intend to do more with the wool in the future. And I think there is a market for it, you know, yarns and like Etsy and quilts. But I haven't really had the time to like skirt and clean the fleeces I've kept, and so every year I intend on doing it and I just don't get to it. So it's an option and it's fun, and you can also just raise sheep for wool. You would want to get a different breed of sheep for that. And for us, because we shear at the end of winter, our wool is all full of hay, so that also makes it difficult and just something to consider. Next slide. Transportation. So we did buy a livestock trailer. The one on the top left, we bought for $1,000. We did have to make a few repairs to it. But I would just say you don't necessarily need one. That top right photo is our butcher's trailer. A lot of times your butcher will have one that you can just use, borrow on processing day. We've also borrowed a lot from neighbors. And I would say, if I were starting over again, I would also, consider like renting from a neighbor for a day or buying one with another neighboring farmer and sharing it. You're really not using it too much. But another advantage of sheep is that they're small and they can fit in other places than livestock trailers. So I include our pickup with the topper because we've also transported sheep just under the topper in the back of the truck. I didn't have a picture of that, but I did have one of putting pigs in there. So that's why I included that. But I've also heard of people using a dog kennel or like building a crate in the back of their pickup. Even SUVs can work if you're only buying a few sheep. And I've heard of people using a Prius. So anything is possible. Next slide. And then, you know, all of this first breeding stock and basic equipment was financed with an FSA microloan. We did take out $20,000 in our first microloan to kind of cover all of these things that I've mentioned in the infrastructure and startup costs. But I will say that that did include some infrastructure for pigs and cattle. So for just the sheep, it wasn't quite that much. The National Young Farmers Coalition has a great guidebook. If you're new to the microloan program, it has really cheap interest. You can also use it for buying land, and it has easier requirements than their regular loan program. But you do need 3 years of management experience. I'm pretty sure that's still the case now. But so it's just something to plan ahead for, that if you're going to want to use a microloan, you should try to get that management experience before you start. And I would say, like, I had, you know, Kinderhook write a letter of recommendation, like saying that I had management experience at the farm. That helped. And then our Farm Beginnings program counted as 1 year too. And so there are other ways to kind of get that management experience. Next slide. Okay, winter. Next slide. So for our winter management, we do bale grazing. If you don't know, bale grazing is a really great soil health practices. It puts down extra carbon and fertilizer on the pasture. So it's a quick way to improve land if it hasn't seen much good management. And it's actually really easy for the farmer. Next slide. So basically we asked the neighbor who we buy our hay from to just set our bales out for us. So that top left photo is his nice fancy tractor. So we didn't have to pay that cost. And there's really not much difference to unloading them in a row or unloading them in a grid. So he doesn't mind at all. I will say that when you're bale grazing sheep, it's nice to be able to find smaller bales and not those really big, huge ones. If they're too tall, like the sheep will eat around the bottom and it kind of becomes a mushroom and then it tips over and it could theoretically crush a sheep or a dog. I've heard from other farms of that happening. But we do also now use baleage. So that's the middle photo. And you can see how that way I've just unwrapped the top to try to get them to eat the top a little bit before they do the bottom. We did decide to do baleage because it has a little bit better nutrition and it kind of increased our lamb weights and just the general health of our breeding stock. And some of our lambs, so most of our lambs go to market in December, but we do keep some of them until the spring for like Easter. And sometimes even if they're, on the smaller side, we'll keep them for a little bit of grazing the next summer. And so the baleage also helps them keep gaining through the winter a little bit better. And the bottom right, we do also now have a tractor to move bales when needed, but in general, our goal is to start it as infrequently as possible anyway. So it's not necessary, especially when you're starting small. Next slide. There are fencing challenges to the winter. Snow will make it really hard to keep your fence hot. Drifting and covering the solar charger. But all I really want to say is, like, especially that second winter when we had more cattle, they got out all the time. The fence was clearly not hot and they just didn't care and they just charged right over it. And we were chasing them all over the place, but the sheep never got out once. And I really think that that's like, because the snow is too deep to trudge through. You can see, like, in that one photo, they're just in the tire tracks and, they can't move as easily or like jump in the snow. And so they stay put better. And really, they just want to stay by the hay anyway. And apparently the cattle are interested in going on tromps through the woods. Next slide. But there are some freezing challenges with fencing. that picture of Jason on the left in his bibs, he's got like the two basic winter tools as I see it. And one is a drill, and that's so that you can move fences if you need to in the winter. You know, we do try to put them up before the ground freezes and have winter all set up. But then if you do end up needing to move a fence, you can just drill a hole to stick the post in. And then the other, you know, basic tool is a rubber mallet, and that's for cracking open water tanks. I have that like metal wire cutters too, which I sometimes use, but be really careful because we've also cracked a lot of tanks. Next slide. So the other watering challenges is like, comes more to back to the freezing. And this is kind of a messy slide. I was trying to show you this gas powered pump we hooked up to the tank in the winter. And that winter it was also extremely cold. It was like when we had all the polar vortexes. So standing out there just waiting for a tank to fill was killing me. And this was a good solution that I wanted other people to know about. But also I needed it more for the cattle than the sheep, because in the winter, sheep just drink like way less water than cattle. So there are times when you could just use a 5-gallon bucket and haul water. It depends on how far out you're bale grazing, but that is an option. And I actually do still do that in the winter because I have different breeding groups. And so like, you know, I think I have 17 sheep and I haul them like 2 gallons of water a day. And that's all they need in that group. They do eat some snow too. And then another thing to think about is like this water tank, if you do have to use this, you have to be careful not to let it freeze in the bottom or in the hose. So you have to make sure every day that you're really draining it out, tipping it up and draining it out. Or if you have a heated garage, that's even better. Also, I've used a heat gun. The heat gun is a nice tool if a hose freezes, to unfreeze that hose pretty quickly. Next slide. If you're concerned about windbreak, you can easily use bales as windbreak. And really when you're bale grazing, I considered all those bales that they're eating windbreak. The snow drifts around them perfectly. And there's always like a place that they can be out of the wind. But you can also set up bales in a row if you have excess bales. Next slide. So for us, December is our breeding season. We lamb on May 15th, so we release the ram on December 15th. And I do use rattle powder from Premier. It's just like a colored powder that you mix with Crisco. I would say it's not necessary, but it does give you peace of mind if you're breeding. And then I do also keep notes just on like the notes app in my phone. When I see that the ram has covered a sheep, I write it down. And then when it's lambing time, I kind of have an idea of who's next in line for lambing. Also, you know, we did buy our first ram. We paid $1,000. You can find a lot of different prices on a ram, but we kind of wanted to start with good genetics. But now we keep rams from our own flock and we trade with other farms who have, you know, similar genetics to us. And that's a lot cheaper. Next slide. I'm going to try to quickly say that while you can do all this stuff without permanent infrastructure, we did then get an NRCS Environmental Quality Incentives Program grant for fencing and water on half of our property. So right now, the south 80 of our farm is fenced and has water lines, and we're in the process of applying for the north 80. And it's been really great for that winter water. We have a Cobat water that, you know, it really only freezes when it gets like down in the single digits. And then I only have to open it once a day, but it's much easier. Like it's not thick ice like what we were used to. But I'll also say like the sheep drink so much less water that really it's the cattle that are propelling me to get these water lines put in, because like when they're on the side of the property with no water lines, I haul water 4 times a day to the cattle in the summer. And it's just, it takes up my entire day pretty much. By the time I'm done hauling, I got to go back again. And so that's another advantage of sheep. Water lines are great, but you can get by without them. Next slide. Pasture lambing. Next slide. So again, you can just do feeder lambs to start. But one of, I think, the greatest joys of shepherding is pasture lambing. And so these are just some of the basic tools, lambing tools, that I feel like people will want. You know, towels for drying off lambs, a bottle, milk replacer, clipboard to keep track of who's lambing, you know, ear tags, I tag them right away. I do also band at birth, usually within about 24 hours to castrate. There are other ways of doing that too, but that's my preferred way. A sling and a scale, I weigh all my lambs. If you're going to be doing breeding, you kind of want to know which are your good ewes, so that eventually you can be making good sort of culling decisions. And a space heater for hypothermic lambs. So next slide. I'd say when you're pasture lambing, kind of the main concern is probably going to be unpredictable weather and hypothermia in your lambs. We had like 2 years in a row of snowstorms in May. So I started making these little lamb sweaters, and they're kind of ridiculous, but they're also really cute. And people on your social media will love them. So there's no reason not to do them if you think they're cute too. Basically, you just take like a sleeve of a wool sweater and cut 2 holes in it. And they like fit perfectly. And I just get those at Goodwill for like $5 a sweater. But then also those shade shelters work great if it's like cold, rainy, freezing rain. The lambs just immediately find it and hang out under there. But I would also say, like, if you have a lamb that you come upon and it is hypothermic, you'll know by putting your thumb in their mouth. And if it feels cold, they're hypothermic. It should feel the same temperature as your finger. So you can also, you know, make like a hot box with a space heater. I bring them inside the garage and do that. But if if you don't have any access to heat, my assumption is that you'll probably have driven there, so you can take them back to your truck, and actually the floor, like if you put all the heat on your floor and like cover them with a towel, that also makes a great hot box and will warm up a hypothermic lamb super quick. Next slide. Lambing jugs. So lambing jugs are really common in barn settings. When you're pasture lambing, I would say first, if you start out with good genetics, you're not going to have problems with nannying. That's like when a ewe that's about to lamb tries to steal a lamb from one who has just had their baby. But I'm going to mention it because it is kind of nice. So last year we had some lamb early by accident, and so we weren't on grass yet, and we were kind of still in our winter bale grazing area. And what I realized is that we had a lot more issues with nannying when they were all just set in one place, and that when we're rotating and we're lambing during grazing season, the other pregnant ewes are just way more interested in eating, and they're less interested in this person having a lamb over here. And so you don't really need a jug, but I will say, like, I built this, Jason built this wooden jug in our winter grazing area last year because I was having a little bit more issues. And then because of that, I started talking to other shepherds, and someone told me about this picture on the right, which is basically just to use a hog panel and pull it around and just use carabiners to clip it shut. And you can actually like roll that around your pasture. And if you do have anyone that's like, you're concerned about, you can just like flip it right over the ewe and the lamb, and, you know, just leave them in there and watch them until you're not concerned with them anymore. And I'll also say that has worked great too when we've had livestock guardian dog puppies. If we feel like we need to, you know, we're not keeping a close eye on them, you can also use this hog panel. And usually the puppies, you're worried about them interfering with lambing a little bit. Next slide.
And we've got about 15 minutes left, Hannah, just to give you a time check.
Okay. I'll just say sheep are great too because they're easier with kids. Kids can help with lambing. Kids can pick up a lamb. Next slide. And everybody loves bottle lambs, even though management of them is more difficult. Like in terms of marketing, they look great on Instagram and Facebook, and you know, it's great for agritourism. Everybody wants to come out and see the lambs. Even adult grown men love a bottle lamb. And even our cat loved our bottle lamb, Penny there. Next slide, health considerations. These are just basic medications and tools. I think I'll try not to go through everything right now, but I wanted to lay it out for people to kind of just see. What's important is that FAMACHA card. You do have to get a certification to get that FAMACHA card, but that is the way to tell if your sheep have anemia from barber poleworm. And it's the way so that you don't have to blanket drench your whole flock. And at this point, you know, I have those dewormers in the top right slide. I have them on hand, but when it comes to barber poleworm, I really only have to deworm maybe 2 ewes at this point in my whole flock. And I know that just by checking for anemia. So if you're really going to get into shepherding, I would say investigate getting this FAMACHA certification. But, you know, ideally you're just dealing with prevention. And the last thing I'll say here is I don't have a crook. A lot of people do use crooks and it's nice to get good at them, but when you're with them every day, watching them, you can also learn how to stalk and catch a lamb without a crook. And if they're truly sick, they're pretty easy to catch. Next slide. Mineral is the basic kind of preventative here for health. You want to give them a loose mineral. That's good. I'll also mention that, you know, on the right, we have this cobalt block, and I'm just going to tell you that, like, we realized our soils were cobalt deficient, they were just kind of not gaining well, and their ears were really scaly. And the mineral we were buying, you know, just basic from the ag store, wasn't really cutting it. And so Janet, our mentor, actually kind of suspected it was cobalt. We gave them this cobalt block just to see what would happen, and they were like obsessed with it. So we do now give a cobalt bolus, which is what's on the right there. You may not have to like ever know about this, but I just mention it in case you ever come across something and you need to know that like a bolus of vitamins and minerals is a possibility. And it really, really helped. Our lambs got a lot bigger and everyone is just way healthier. Next slide. So we also discovered that up in this area, we have what's called liver fluke. This is a different parasite. You may not have it where you are. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but I was just going to say here that, you know, if you have livestock, you're eventually going to have dead stock. That's the case for any animal you raise. The advantage of doing sheep is it's much easier to get rid of dead stock than it is with a cow. And, you know, I was actually able to lift that poor dead ewe onto the back of the four-wheeler there myself. But also I've used sleds in the winter to make it really easy to move them. And you can learn how to do this necropsy where you can see what's causing death in your flock. That's another thing you could take a course on to learn more about if it's something you're not too squeamish about. Next slide. 3 quick things. You might want to watch for pink eye. For us, it actually happens in the winter more than the summer because of actually seed heads from the hay getting in their eyes. When it comes to bloat, so you know the question about sheep bloat easily. When you're feeding them grass, I've not had that be the case. I actually didn't even know how to treat bloat until last summer. This ewe started eating yarrow, which turns out is toxic. That was the first time I ever saw bloat and had to treat bloat. But that's to say, do watch for toxicity and kind of learn what plants are in your pasture. But I'll also note that she's the only one of my ewes who was eating it. And really, you know, lambs will like watch their mother to learn what to eat. And so if someone's eating something toxic, you really don't want them in your flock anyway. And then the last one, sore mouth, that's a common one. It's kind of like chicken pox. So it's a virus that they'll just get over on their own, but you should know that it's zoonotic, which means it can be transferred to humans. So if you have like a cut on your hand, you don't want to touch it because it could transfer to you, but it should clear up on its own. That top right photo was like a pretty bad scab that was taking a long time to clear up. And basically he just needed like a nutritional boost. Like I gave him some B vitamins and some Nutri-Drench, and then it finally cleared up. Next, marketing and sales.
Let's get through this piece because so we can get to some of the Q&A.
Okay.
But let me Trying to. There. How's that?
Okay.
Oh, nope. Actually, that's the one. I have too many screens going on. Perfect. So I want to bring in some of the questions that we were getting from the chat box. One of them being, when you're doing bale grazing, how do you do fencing around those? Do you fence around a specific bale or multiple bales at a time?
I fence around multiple bales, but I do like smaller versions of rotation. So I do make a couple of paddocks so that they are kind of rotating through a smaller area over the course of the winter.
Fantastic. Another question was, and I may mess this up. Let's see. Nope, let's go to this one. I'll come back to that one. What breeds of livestock guardian dogs do you prefer?
We have what's considered close guarding dogs, and that works much better for our situation. And so those breeds our dogs are Maremma crossed with Spanish Mastiff, crossed with Polish Tatra, and a little bit of Central Asian Shepherd. Basically, these are dogs that were kind of bred for dairying. And so they're used to staying close to the animals and, like moving with the sheep to come down for milking every day. It was kind of how they were bred. And so they're less like a Great Pyrenees, which what I have heard, I've never had one, are more likely to roam and kind of want to cover a huge area.
Awesome. Thank you. And Juliet asked, can you talk a little bit about Cossack lymphangitis? I might have said that wrong.
Cassius, I don't know how to say it either.
Okay, but you know what I'm talking about.
I do know what you're talking about. So yeah, that's also another one where it's kind of like if you get it in your flock, you can't really get rid of it, and you need to cull to kind of get rid of it. That's all I know about it. It's one to ask about when you're buying your sheep. I don't know if there's more questions about how to treat or whatever, but
yeah. We did have one question around how do you treat bloat?
So you drench with mineral oil, or at the egg store, there's just like a bloat treatment you can drench. So you use that drench gun and it's like a liquid you squirt into their mouth.
Easy enough. We also had a question around, can you graze rye cover crop, or can it be used to either as forage or baling for your to feed later?
I think so, but I'm not an expert on that topic, so perfect. I'm not going to say anything I don't know for sure.
Yeah. That makes sense. And then there was another question around, what's the maximum days that you would keep your sheep in one place with the parasite load in mind?
To be really safe, I would say 3 days. You could maybe push it to 5. But really, like, the height of infectiousness is 30 days. So really the most important thing to think about when you're planning is just to not be back at the place where they were on the 30-day mark, because that's when the parasite load is heaviest in that pasture.
Perfect. And then another question here, have you seen using grazing panels as shade, or solar panels when grazing for shade?
Yeah, I mean, I know sheep are being used a lot on solar farms now because like they fit underneath the solar panels, and it's not like cattle that would probably be like scraping up against them. But if you got a big enough solar panel, I mean, you could use it as shade, but I don't know how easily mobile a big one would be. But it is a thing, like if there are like solar farms near you, you could look at contract grazing to take care of weeds underneath. It's definitely becoming like a popular thing.
For sure. And I shared an article that Megan Filbert had written about that.
Oh, cool. So,
perfect. And then somebody had asked about how many sheep you started with.
We started with 20, and that was both ewes and feeders. And I would say, 20 in like the 2 fence square is what we started with.
Perfect. And then John had asked about pasture mix would be different from cattle, or do you use the same pasture feeding mix?
We use the same pasture for both our sheep and our cattle. I mean, they do prefer a little bit different plants, but that works well for the soil health. And, you know, our pastures weren't great to start with. And I do like occasionally hand broadcast in like places that aren't, but places that are kind of bare. And mostly I'm putting out more clovers. And that's just more protein.
And do you integrate the cattle and sheep into, like, do you have them one follow the other through some of your grazing paddocks, or do you keep them in separate?
I have done that, but I don't anymore. We do have enough land that we don't really have to do it that way. I would say, you know, if you have a smaller acreage, that works too. And at Kinderhook, they do a leader follower system. And so you can kind of investigate that more depending on your situation.
Fantastic. We do have a lot of people wanting to know more about your marketing.
Yeah. Sorry.
So we do. So would it be possible to put your slides up on, we have a section that we can share that with everyone if you're okay with that.
Yes. Yep.
Perfect. And we do have a few minutes and I'm out of questions. So do you want to maybe give kind of an overview of your marketing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so just real quickly, like what we do is use our website and take orders online. And like one thing I would say is it's good to know your market before you're starting, like who you think you're going to sell to and how much demand there is where you are. But one thing I'm going to mention that I think is important is there's a huge demand for lamb in other markets. And so one area that I think is like a growing area would be shipping lamb meat. So even if you feel like you don't have a local market, I would investigate, you know, boxing and shipping lamb. I think that you could do well that way. But a consideration with that is processing and what you have available to you. For us, it has to be USDA processed in order to ship individual cuts across state lines. I think in Iowa, you can now ship across state lines, but the other thing I would say is like, put your face and your personal story on your website. Don't be afraid to put your face there. People want to connect with you. Same with, you know, social media. They want to talk to you directly. They want to interact with you. If you have a hard time like telling your own story, ask a friend or family member to write your bio for you. And then, you know, we do take orders online. I would say you don't need a fancy e-commerce platform when you're starting. You can just use a Google form to take orders unless you are going to ship. And then I would say start investigating some of those e-commerce platforms. And then the other thing I really want to tell people is get yourself on Google My Business. That is the best way to increase your search optimization and like where you come in Google's search listings. It's really easy. You sign up. They send you a pin in the mail on a postcard to verify that that is your address. And then you start showing up on Google Maps and then fill in as much information as you can on Google My Business. And that will increase your search listings. That helps a lot. Also, simple flyers at co-ops and grocery stores got me a ton of customers in the beginning. And you can use the Canva app if you don't feel like you're good at making graphic designing stuff. They have tons of really easy templates. And that worked surprisingly well.
All right. Sorry, I just uploaded the slides up in the file section so people can access it there. So I think that brings us to the end. Thank you so much, Hannah. So much information, so little time. Hopefully we'll hear from you again, but we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And I know you've been part of the conference and part of Practical Farmers for a while. So yeah. We appreciate your support. Even up in Minnesota, it's nice to have friends on state.